go. First of all, this unfortunately is not the first time this committee has been presented with a situation like this. It's been the first time we've been presented one that involved a Supreme Court justice. We have other people nominated before this court where there are allegations by former wives of mistreatment and wife beating. There's no appropriate forum to resolve that, as you point out. Now, we have an option in that particular case to say, well, we'll send it to the court first. Before we decide whether to confirm this particular person, have the court decide that issue. Believe me, I'd like this. I didn't sign on to this job or run for it to be a judge. If I wanted to do that, I'd be a judge now in my home state. I don't want to be a judge. I hate this job. But all of my colleagues here were telling everybody how awful the process is. I'm going to be completely blunt about it. It's like democracy. It's a lousy form of government, except no one's figured out another way. Now, I can turn around and I can say to this particular person whose wife has come forward and said it's been abused, I can say, I tell you what, we're going to disregard that and we're going to confirm you anyway. Or I can say, I don't believe it, therefore I'm not going to tell these fellas, which I have done on other matters unrelated to wife beating. There's been more nominees sent up here with the last two administrations that have had drug problems I've never even told these folks about. Because they happened 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I take the heat and I'll take the responsibility and I'll continue to do as long as I'm chairman, no matter what these guys think of this process. Okay? Number one. Number two, when an allegation of consequence comes forward, I do not have the recourse to send it to the courts. I have the recourse only to send it to my colleagues. There is no other institutional way of doing it. I made a judgment on this one. My trust was violated by somebody. And then the fat was in the fire. But we'd be in the same position if the day before the hearing began, Ms. Hill, unrelated to any statement of this committee, stood up and held a press conference and said, as I spoke with counsel, as the possibility could happen from the White House, and just held a press conference. Be in the same spot. We could say we're not going to resolve that, let's put this nomination on hold and send it to the courts. Not a possibility. Not able to do that, no matter what my colleagues who are now telling everybody how horrible this process is. Now let me say another thing. This isn't over. Your grandfather's right. You have no right to give up. There's compelling arguments to be made for you, and they may end up being made by me and others. For example, one of the arguments made against you constantly by those who opposed your nomination is here's a guy who's sought this. He's suckered it. He's gone out and he's laid down for people for it. And he's not dumb. A guy who wanted this in the beginning. I heard people coming to us and testifying saying, you wanted this and planned this since the late 70s. Well, if you planned this in the late 70s and you did this, you're one of the dumbest people I've ever run across in my life. And you don't impress me as being dumb. Your defenders here haven't even been smart enough to figure out to make that defense for you. My job is not to defend you or to prosecute you. It's to see to it you get a fair shot in a system that's imperfect, but it's a good system. Now, everybody points out what hadn't been made here. Every expert that's ever testified before me in this committee on an issue that I do know something about, and I've spent, with the exception of maybe one person on this committee, more time dealing with abuse against women and the surrounding circumstances than anybody else in the Senate. And every expert comes forward and says, there's a pattern. It doesn't happen in isolated incidents. It's a pattern. If there's not a pattern, to me, that's probative. That has some dispositive weight. No one's proved a pattern here of anything. We're not finished yet, but no one's proved a pattern. Again, these people have decided already once and for all they're for you or against you. You need better lawyers. You need to hire me. I'm getting fed up with this stuff about how terrible this system is. I hear everybody talk about how terrible the primary system is. We're big boys. I knew when I ran for president everything was free game. Anybody who runs for the Supreme Court or is appointed to the Supreme Court, to be more precise, should understand. It's not Boy Scouts, it's not Cub Scouts. In the case of the presidents, for the right to be leader of the free world, and no one ever said it would be easy. And whoever goes in the Supreme Court is going to determine the fate of this country more than anybody. For the next 20 years, we're going to have people scrupulous and unscrupulous.